The desert still held the heat of the dying day, a dry breath rolling over the land like a furnace exhaling. Sagebrush trembled in a whisper of wind, carrying the faint rattle of a distant snake. Above the jagged spine of the canyon rim, the sun sagged low and blood-red, painting the cliffs in bruised purples and copper fire. Every shadow stretched long and hungry across the scorched trail that wound through the Badlands, a trail only the desperate or the damned would ride after dusk. Clay Black Spur, Rourke reined in his black mare at the ridge and surveyed the emptiness below. A scar split his left cheek like a lightning bolt, pale against the sun-browned skin, and the black spur on his right boot caught the last glint of light as he shifted in the saddle. Behind him his lieutenants fanned out, Jeb with his wolf grin and twitching fingers near the trigger, lanky Mace chewing a straw slick with dust, and the silent brothers Orrin and Luke, whose eyes reflected nothing but cold moonlight even before night fell. They had ridden hard for 3 days, raiding 2 stagecoaches and a silver shipment, and now the canyon felt like their own cathedral of lawlessness. Jeb spat into the dirt and broke the quiet. "Ain't a soul out here, Clay. You sure the marshal won't catch up?" Clay's smile was a thin, cruel crescent. "Marshal's 3 days behind and drunk on his own trail dust. We own this stretch tonight." He shifted again, restless, a hunter's instinct humming in his bones. The desert was too still, the silence carrying a tension he couldn't name. Stories had followed them from town to town, stories of a bounty hunter no man could kill, a shadow who struck like a hawk and vanished before the echoes of gunfire died. They laughed about it around the fire, called him ghost and myth, but even Clay found himself listening when the wind keened through the rocks. They said the hawk had eyes like a storm and could smell fear the way coyotes smelled blood. A campfire tale, Clay told himself, yet he tightened his grip on the reins all the same. A flicker of movement stirred the horizon, a faint smear of dust rising where the trail bent between 2 sandstone pillars. Clay lifted a hand, and the gang quieted in unison. Through the shimmer of heat emerged a lone rider, pace unhurried, the shape almost spectral against the burning sky. The horse, a rangy dun with a sway to its gait, plodded with the patience of long miles. The rider wore a duster bleached the color of old parchment, brim of a sweat-stained hat pulled low. Nothing about him said threat. Everything about him said alone. "Old man lost his way," Mace muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. The rider came on until the distance between them narrowed to the length of a church aisle. He did not falter when he saw 5 figures waiting, guns loose in their holsters. He merely slowed the horse to a stop and lifted his face. Under the shadow of the hat brim gleamed eyes the color of storm clouds before a break, calm and measuring. Clay nudged his mare forward until he loomed over the stranger. "Evenin', traveler. Awful late to be out where buzzards keep their watch. Name yourself." The man regarded him for a long beat, the wind teasing the edges of his coat. "Names blow away in the desert," he said quietly, voice rasped like gravel, yet carrying a weight that settled over them all. Luke let out a low chuckle. "Poet, huh? Maybe he's got silver in them saddlebags to match his fancy talk." Clay's smile returned, sharper. "Let's have a look, friend. Dismount nice and easy." The stranger's gaze flicked across the circle of riders, unreadable. Then he swung a leg over and landed lightly despite the stiffness of years etched into his weathered face. His hand stayed visible, palms open. The horse snorted and lowered its head, as if sensing the shift in the air. Jeb stepped forward, rifle angled. "What's a lone drifter doing on Blackspur land?" "I wasn't aware land could be owned by thieves," the stranger replied, tone mild but carrying an undercurrent of iron. Jeb's jaw tightened. Clay raised a hand, silencing the spark before it flared. Something about the man's calm scraped against his nerves like a whetstone. He searched for fear in those gray eyes, and found none. "Search him," Clay ordered. Mace approached, quick hands patting down the coat. He found only a canteen, a hunting knife worn smooth from years of use, and a revolver of ordinary make. Nothing to mark him as more than a weary traveler. Yet when Mace reached for the gun, the stranger's gaze sharpened, just a flicker, like the glint of steel before a draw. Mace's fingers hesitated despite himself. "Relax," the man said softly. It bites only when provoked. Clay took the revolver anyway, weighing it in his palm. Standard Colt, but the grip bore a faint etching of a hawk mid-dive, wings flared. He felt a tremor of recognition, though he couldn't place it. "Pretty carving," he said, masking the unease. "Where'd you get it?" "A gift," the stranger answered, "from someone who believed in justice." The words hung in the cooling dusk. Coyotes began to yip far off, a mournful chorus that made the horses shift. Clay decided he'd had enough of riddles. "Tie him," he ordered. "We'll let the night sweat the truth out of him." Orrin produced a length of rope, and still the man did not resist. He simply watched each outlaw in turn, gaze steady as the stars pricking the darkening sky. When the knot cinched tight around his wrists, he inclined his head slightly, as though humoring children at play. As they led him toward the waiting canyon, the first chill of evening crept over the land. The moon rose sharp and white, throwing silver edges on every rock. Clay felt the night close in, heavy with a silence that no laughter could break. Behind him the prisoner walked with the measured steps of a man who knew exactly where he was going and why. For the first time in years, Clay Rourke felt the stir of something he could not name, something colder than fear and far older than the law. Moonlight pooled like liquid silver across the canyon floor, tracing the edges of jagged walls that rose in silent judgment. The gang wound through the narrow pass, their prisoner bound, and walking with a steady stride that never once faltered. Pebbles skittered under hooves and boots, each sound swallowed by the sheer rock faces. Overhead, the stars glimmered like cold eyes watching from an infinite distance. Clay Rourke led the procession, his black mare throwing shadows long as gallows beams. Behind him, Jeb carried a lantern that cast a trembling glow over the prisoner's weathered face. The stranger's calm unnerved them more than the endless dark. He moved without complaint, as if he were guiding them rather than being led. The canyon widened into a natural bowl, where a stunted cottonwood leaned over a circle of blackened stones. Mace and the Silent Brothers set to work, striking flint until sparks licked a bundle of dry grass. Soon firelight snapped against the rock, painting the cliffs in restless orange and turning the night's chill into a low, wavering heat. Shadows leapt and twisted across their faces, transforming them into something almost otherworldly. Clay shoved the stranger onto a flat boulder near the flames. "Sit," he said, the single word echoing off the canyon walls. The man lowered himself with a grace that belonged to someone who chose his battles carefully. Rope bound his wrists, but he held them lightly on his knees, as if the knots were merely decoration. Jeb squatted close, the fire reflecting in his restless eyes. "You gonna tell us where you're headed, old-timer? Or just keep staring like a stone idol?" The prisoner tilted his head slightly. The trail doesn't ask where a man is going, only if he deserves to arrive. His voice was soft enough that the wind almost stole it, but each word landed with unsettling precision. Mace barked a laugh. "That's fine talk for a drifter who's about to spend the night in our company. Maybe we sell you back to whatever town you wandered from. Might fetch a bit of gold if someone misses your sermons." Clay removed his hat and ran a hand through hair damp with sweat. "Gold's not a bad thought," he said, eyes narrowing. "Some rich ranchers got to be looking for his long-lost uncle. We send a note, collect a ransom, and leave this desert a little heavier in the pockets." He studied the stranger. "What do you think your life is worth, friend?" The man met his gaze without blinking. "Gold weighs down those who chase it. The more you carry, the deeper you sink." Luke shifted uncomfortably and spat into the fire, where the saliva hissed like a snake. "He talks like a preacher. Maybe we should just shut him up." Clay ignored the suggestion. He sensed something beyond mere bravado in the prisoner's calm. The man's eyes moved with quiet calculation, noting the placement of each gun, each careless movement. Even bound, he carried himself like someone who knew the rhythm of violence better than any outlaw present. As the night deepened, the fire crackled, and the gang's laughter tried to fill the oppressive silence. They passed a flask of rye whiskey, and stories began to spill. Old raids, narrow escapes, the thrill of a stagecoach screaming to a halt beneath their pistols. Mace bragged about the banker in Abilene who'd begged for mercy before they left him face down in the dust. Jeb recounted the night they burned a ranch for refusing tribute, flames painting the prairie sky while cattle bellowed in terror. The stranger listened without interruption, his eyes reflecting the firelight like twin embers. When they finally paused, he spoke so quietly that the wind almost drowned him out. Each life you ended has a way of following you. They ride behind you in silence, waiting for the trail to narrow. Jeb bristled, hand twitching near his revolver. You threatening us, old man? I'm reminding you. The prisoner said, voice steady. The desert remembers. So do the dead. The canyon seemed to contract around them. A coyote howled in the distance, the note long and mournful, and the horses stamped nervously as if they, too, sensed a shift in the air. Clay tried to shake it off. You think ghosts scare us? We've stared down Marshalls and Pinkertons. We make ghosts. Yet even he felt a flicker of unease. He rose to stretch his legs and caught a movement from the corner of his eye, so fast he almost doubted it. The prisoner had adjusted his seat, subtle as a breeze, though his bound hands had not moved. For a heartbeat, Clay thought he'd seen the rope slacken, but when he looked again, the knot lay tight. Perhaps the firelight played tricks. Orrin, ever watchful, tilted his head. Did you see? He began, then stopped unsure. The stranger smiled faintly, a gesture without warmth. A man doesn't escape by rope alone. Clay turned his back to hide the shiver crawling his spine. He remembered stories from Kansas City, whispered by gamblers and bounty men alike. Tales of a hunter who could break a man's wrist before he drew, who vanished from locked cells and left only a hawk's cry in the night. Folklore, he told himself. Yet the etching on that revolver's grip clawed at his memory. As the whiskey burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, the gang grew restless. Luke dozed against a rock, his rifle slipping across his lap. Jeb paced like a caged wolf. Mace muttered about taking shifts, though none of them trusted the others enough to sleep soundly. The prisoner watched them all, every blink deliberate. When Jeb passed behind him, the man shifted a fraction, just enough that the outlaw's boot caught on a loose stone and sent him stumbling. Jeb cursed, and the stranger offered a single, almost apologetic nod. It was nothing, except Clay could have sworn he saw the rope twist looser with emotion. Memory stirred unbidden. The ambush at Dead Horse Crossing when Clay was barely more than a boy. The first kill that had marked him forever. He saw again the marshal who had nearly ended him, a shadowed figure who moved with impossible speed. The same steady gray eyes. His chest tightened. You ever kill a man? Clay asked suddenly, voice rough. The stranger looked up, the firelight catching the edges of his face. I've ended what needed ending. That's supposed to scare me? It isn't about fear, the man replied. It's about balance. Even the desert keeps its books. The words settled like dust on a coffin lid. No one spoke for a long moment. The fire popped, sending a stream of sparks swirling into the starlit void. Far off, thunder rolled over the horizon, low and distant, like hooves of an unseen army. The prisoner tilted his head as if listening to some private signal. His eyes gleamed with quiet certainty, and for the first time Clay sensed that they were not the hunters at all. They were prey, moving exactly where the stranger intended. The night deepened, the canyon walls cold and eternal, and an invisible weight pressed down on every outlaw's chest. Somewhere in the darkness, the desert waited, keeping its silent account, and the man they believed was their captive sat motionless, the faintest curve of a knowing smile tracing his lips. A restless wind prowled the canyon as midnight deepened, carrying with it the dry hiss of sand against stone. It came in sudden gusts that made the flames leap and the cottonwood shiver, as though the desert itself had roused to witness what men would not admit aloud. Coyotes wailed from far ridges, their cries rising and falling like a lament, each note threading through the camp until even the horses stamped and tossed their heads in nervous cadence. Clay Rourke sat stiff back by the fire, hat pulled low, watching sparks twist upward and vanish into the dark. The stranger remained where they had left him on the boulder, wrists still bound, eyes half closed as if listening to a tune only he could hear. Nothing about him strained against the rope, yet every time Clay glanced that way, He swore the knots looked a shade looser, the coils of hemp no longer biting into the skin, as they had hours earlier. Jeb cursed softly while checking his rifle. "Clay, you been at this as long as me. Rope don't wear thin in a single night." He held up the frayed end of a tie-down they'd used on the pack horse, fibers splayed like a dead man's hair. "Feels cut, not worn." "Maybe you tied it wrong," Mace offered, though his voice lacked heat. He kept darting glances toward the prisoner, chewing his straw to a pulpy mess. "Wrong." Jeb barked a laugh that cracked like kindling. "I could tie a hangman's not drunk and blindfolded. This is something else." Clay's jaw tightened. "Then keep your eyes sharp and your mouth shut." But unease threaded through his words. He'd checked the rifles earlier. Now two lay shifted a yard from where he remembered, their barrels angled toward the rocks as if nudged by an invisible hand. The stranger finally opened his eyes, gray as stormlight. "Desert winds play tricks," he said, voice calm and measured. "They like to remind men of how small they are." Luke spat into the fire. "You talk like the devil's parson. Maybe you've been sneaking around while we blink." "Would you believe me if I said I never moved?" the man asked. "Would you believe your own eyes if they told you otherwise?" The question hung heavier than the wind. The coyotes answered with another mournful chorus, closer now, a rolling call that seemed to circle the canyon walls. The horses shifted and snorted, sensing something the men could not name. Clay rose, restless. "Enough riddles. You're bound tight as sin. You so much as twitch wrong, and you'll find yourself full of lead." The prisoner regarded him steadily. "Leads a heavy way to learn what you already fear." Mace threw the chewed straw into the fire, sparks bursting like tiny meteors. "And what's that supposed to be?" "That justice doesn't sleep," the stranger replied. "It waits, patient as stone. Every step you take, it matches. Every cruelty you've buried, it remembers." The words pressed into the canyon like a gathering storm. Even the fire's crackle seemed to fade beneath the low moan of the wind. Clay's memory flared unbidden. Faces of the men he'd left bleeding in dust, a ranch house engulfed in flames, a child's cry lost to the night. He shook it off, angry at himself for letting an old man's whispers stir ghosts. Jeb, already riding the edge of too much whiskey, lurched to his feet. "I've had enough of this spook talk. I say we end him now, bury him where the buzzards can't find the bones." He drew his revolver in a single reckless motion. Clay stepped between them. "Put away." "Why?" Jeb's eyes glittered with a fevered light. "You scared of a man who don't fight back?" Before Clay could answer, a sudden gust roared down the canyon, snuffing the fire to embers and pitching the camp into darkness. Horses screamed and jerked at their tethers. Jeb spun, startled, his boots slipping on loose shale. The gun discharged with a thunderous crack, the flash a brief starburst against the night. A heartbeat later, Jeb tumbled backward over a low ledge, the echo of his scream swallowed by the canyon depths. The wind died as quickly as it had risen. Silence returned, vast and impenetrable. Mace scrambled to the edge, peered down into the darkness. "He's gone," he whispered, voice shaking. "God help us, he's gone." Clay stared at the stranger, whose face remained a mask of calm. "You!" Clay hissed, though he knew the man hadn't moved an inch. "What devilry is this?" "Not devilry," the prisoner said softly. "Balance. The desert collects its debts in ways men don't always see." Luke backed away, eyes wide, the whites bright as moonlit bone. "He's cursed, Clay. We need to cut him loose, right out before more of us fall." Clay clenched his fists until the leather of his gloves creaked. He refused to yield to fear, yet it seeped into him all the same, a cold that started in the spine and spread like a winter frost. He remembered again the stories of a bounty hunter who came and went like a phantom, who brought justice where the law had failed. A hawk on the wind, some said. A spirit of vengeance, others whispered. The prisoner shifted slightly, and Clay caught a glint where moonlight touched the rope. A single strand, parted clean as if sliced by a razor. Clay blinked, and the image was gone. "You think you hold me," the man said, voice low, but carrying to every corner of the canyon. "But the truth is simpler. I stay because the hour is not yet right. The coyotes began again, their howls threading through the rocks until it seemed the very cliffs keened with them. Clay's mare reared, nostrils flaring at a scent beyond human reach. The air tasted of iron, of distant rain that never came. Mace drew back toward the fire pit, fumbling to relight the embers with shaking hands. "We can't stay here, Clay. This place ain't natural." Clay forced a steady breath. "We stay. At dawn we move. He's coming with us till I know who he is and who'll pay for him." Yet the words felt thin, an echo of authority already slipping. The stranger's eyes caught the moon, gleaming like tempered steel. "Dawn," he murmured, almost to himself. "Yes, that will do." The remaining hours stretched like a lifetime. Shadows shifted where none should be. Ropes creaked though no wind stirred. And in the stillness, the men felt the weight of their own sins pressing closer, as if the desert had finally decided to reckon with them. Thunder rumbled beyond the canyon walls, a low growl that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The air thickened with the metallic scent of rain long before the first drop fell. Clay Rourke tilted his face to the black sky and felt the pressure change, the charged hush of a storm about to break. Lightning forked along the distant ridges, a jagged white wound in the heavens. The stranger sat motionless on his boulder, ropes still draped around his wrists, eyes reflecting each flash like polished steel. He had not spoken since Jeb's fall, yet his silence weighed heavier than words. Mace cursed under his breath as he tried to coax flame from damp tinder, the last embers stubbornly dying in the wind. Luke paced the perimeter with rifle in hand, the tremor in his step betraying the bravado of earlier hours. A gust tore through the canyon, carrying a sheet of sand that stung exposed skin. Then the storm descended in earnest. Rain came in sudden torrents, fat drops exploding in the dust, turning the ground to slick clay within moments. The fire hissed and guttered out, plunging the camp into a darkness lit only by lightning that strobed the rock walls in ghostly whites and purples. "Keep your eyes open," Clay barked over the roar, though his voice felt swallowed by the storm. A sharp crack split the night, not thunder, but the snap of rope. Clay spun. The boulder where the prisoner had sat was empty. "Where?" Mace's shout was cut short by a sudden blur in the darkness. His rifle flew from his hands with a metallic clang as a shadow slammed into him and disappeared again before Clay could fire. Mace collapsed with a grunt, clutching his wrist. Lightning flashed, and for a heartbeat Clay glimpsed the stranger, a gray phantom gliding between rocks slick with rain, movements impossibly swift. He was no longer bound. Luke raised his weapon, eyes wild. "I see him." The words ended in a cry as his hat was whipped from his head by a sudden rush of air. The stranger's hand had found Luke's rifle and twisted it away with a motion so fluid it seemed conjured from the storm itself. Luke stumbled back, staring at his empty hands as if they'd betrayed him. Clay drew his revolver and turned in a slow circle, rain plastering his coat to his shoulders. Each flash of lightning revealed only fragments. A flicker of movement atop a ledge, the gleam of eyes in the downpour, then nothing but driving rain. The canyon had become a labyrinth of shadows and echoes. "Show yourself," Clay shouted, though the wind carried his words away. A whisper came from behind, close enough that the hair on Clay's neck rose. "I'm right where you left me." He spun and fired. The shot cracked like a whip, ricocheting off wet stone. Empty air. Another bolt of lightning illuminated the stranger, crouched atop a narrow outcrop, a silhouette framed by electric light. In his hand glinted a revolver, Clay's own, or so he thought until he saw the telltale etching of a hawk diving with talons spread. Recognition struck like a physical blow. The hawk. Stories flooded back with brutal clarity. The bounty hunter who had single-handedly dismantled the Carson City gang, who brought murderers to justice across 3 territories and vanished like mist. No one had ever captured him. Some doubted he even existed. Clay had mocked the tales around many a campfire, but the hawk-etched grip was proof carved in steel. A gunshot cracked through the storm. Luke cried out and dropped to his knees. His own bullet fired upward as the weapon was knocked from his grip. Mace crawled backward on the mud, his breath ragged, fear etched deep in his face. "You've spilled enough blood," the stranger's voice carried. calm and cutting through wind and thunder. The desert has kept your accounts. Tonight we settle them. Clay's heart hammered as he backed toward the remaining horses. He leveled his pistol at the moving shadow, but a sudden slide of mud sent him stumbling. A figure materialized beside him, faster than thought. A hand struck his wrist, sending his revolver spinning into the muck. Before he could recover, the cold barrel of the stranger's weapon pressed against his temple. The storm raged around them, rain cascading off their hats, lightning revealing the hawk engraved in the silver grip inches from Clay's eye. In that moment he understood the inevitability of it all. Every theft, every killing, every cruel laugh on the trail had led here, to this silent reckoning under a sky split by thunder. "You're him," Clay rasped, voice barely audible over the storm. "The hawk." The stranger's gray eyes held no triumph, only a grim resolve. "I am the consequence you chose to meet." Mace groaned from the mud. Luke sat frozen, disarmed and wide-eyed, the storm washing grime from his face until he looked like a chastened child. The horses pulled at their reins, eyes rolling white in panic as another thunderclap boomed overhead. Clay swallowed hard, the taste of rain and iron on his tongue. "You gonna kill us?" The hawk eased the revolver back, but did not lower it. "Death is a mercy you don't deserve. You'll ride to Red Mesa at dawn. The marshal waits for men like you." He gestured toward the others, with a tilt of the barrel. "Alive!" Lightning flashed again, and for an instant the storm seemed to pause, holding its breath. Clay saw in the man's stance the certainty of someone who had walked through fire and never flinched. This was no drifter, no meth. This was justice carved in flesh and bone. Rain hammered down, erasing footprints and blood alike, until the canyon itself seemed reborn. One by one the outlaws dropped their weapons, the clatter of metal lost beneath the thunder. The hawk lowered his gun at last, the hawk's image glistening in the stormlight, and stepped back into the darkness from which he had come, leaving only the certainty that the legend was real and the night would never forget his name. The storm spent itself in the small hours, leaving the canyon washed clean and smelling of wet stone and iron. A bruised silence settled over the land, broken only by the soft drip of water from ledges high above. When the first thread of dawn unspooled across the eastern rim, it lit the world in copper and rose, as if the desert had been forged anew. Clay Rourke lay half upright against a boulder, wrists bound by the same rope he had used on the stranger. The cords bit deep, already stiffening with the chill of night. His men crouched nearby in sullen silence, Mace with his head bowed and a rag tied around his sprained wrist, Luke pale and wide-eyed, Orin sitting rigid as a stone. Jeb's absence lingered like a phantom, the memory of a scream echoing with every gust of morning wind. Across the camp, the hawk moved with the deliberate calm of someone who no longer needed speed. He had relit the fire, a small controlled blaze that sent steady smoke toward the awakening sky. His revolver rested on a flat rock within easy reach, the etched hawk on the grip catching the newborn light like a silent signature. Clay watched the man pour water from a canteen into a dented tin cup. The bounty hunter's movements were precise, almost reverent, as though each task was a private ritual. When he finally turned, his eyes were the same unyielding gray Clay had seen the night before, stormlight now tempered by the quiet of dawn. "You could have killed us," Clay said, voice hoarse. "I could have," the hawk replied, "but death would end the lesson." Mace shifted uncomfortably. "What lesson?" "That every choice leaves a trail," the hawk said, gaze never leaving Clay. "Yours is long and red. The marshal in red, Mesa keeps a ledger for men like you. He's waited a long time to balance it." Clay clenched his jaw, the taste of rain and blood still bitter on his tongue. "You think you're justice. You're just another killer hiding behind a badge nobody gave you." The hawk stepped closer, the morning light carving sharp planes across his face. "I don't need a badge. Justice belongs to the land. I only carry its voice." The words landed heavier than a bullet. Clay found himself staring at the hawk engraved on the revolver, the metal now gleaming like molten sunrise. Memories surged unbidden, farm set aflame, the cry of a child he'd left behind, the look in a dying lawman's eyes. Each sin came back with the certainty of a debt long unpaid. Behind him, The other outlaws began to murmur, the thin edge of panic creeping into their voices. "We'll ride quiet," Luke blurted. "Take us in. Just don't let him loose again." "You'll ride to Red Mesa," the hawk said evenly. "The marshal will hear your names before the sun stands high. Whether you arrive breathing depends on how well you listen." He cut the ropes at Clay's ankles with a swift motion, the knife's edge whispering through wet fiber. "You first," he commanded. "Mount up." Clay rose slowly, every muscle stiff with cold and resentment. He met the bounty hunter's gaze and found no triumph there, only the implacable certainty of a man who had seen too much to hate or gloat. The absence of malice was more frightening than any threat. They saddled the horses in silence. The desert floor, once a battlefield of mud and chaos, now shone with a fragile peace beneath the broadening light. High above, a lone hawk traced slow circles in the sky, its cry a single sharp note that carried across the canyon and back again. When the gang was mounted, the hawk took his place at the rear, revolver low but steady, every motion unhurried. They began the slow ride eastward, hooves squelching in damp clay, the rising sun throwing their shadows long and thin across the land. The silence of the ride became its own judgment, heavier than chains. At the edge of the canyon, Clay drew rein and turned in the saddle. "What's your real name?" he asked, unable to keep the question from slipping free. The hawk regarded him for a long moment, the faintest curve of a smile touching his lips. "Names are for men who need remembering," he said. "I'm a reminder." With that he tapped his heels to his horse and moved ahead, guiding them out of the canyon and into the swelling light. Behind them the storm's debris glimmered in scattered pools, a record of the night that no one would fully believe. By the time they reached the open plain, the sun had risen like a blade of gold, slicing through the last tatters of cloud. Heat began to shimmer off the drenched earth, and the scent of wet sage filled the air. The hawk slowed and turned his horse toward a narrow trail leading south. "This is where we part," he said. "Follow the main road. By noon you'll see Red Mesa." Mesa's voice cracked. "You're just letting us ride? What if we run?" "Run if you wish," the hawk replied, "but you'll find no place beyond the reach of your own deeds." He held Clay's gaze one final time, the weight of unspoken truths passing like a current between them. There was no gloating, no threat, only the quiet certainty that justice, once set in motion, required no witness. Without another word, he turned his horse toward the rising sun. Light caught the hawk on his revolver, flaring briefly like fire before fading into the glare of morning. The figure of the bounty hunter grew smaller against the endless horizon until he was nothing more than a solitary shadow riding the line between earth and sky. Long after he vanished, the gang sat motionless, each man bound more by fear than rope. Somewhere behind them the canyon held its secrets, and somewhere ahead the marshal waited. Word of what had happened would spread like prairie fire, passed from saloon to campfire, told in hushed voices as legend, how a gang of cutthroats once believed they had captured a harmless drifter, only to find themselves caught in the talons of the West's most feared hunter. And in every telling, when the tale reached the final moment, the listener would swear they heard a hawk's cry riding the wind at dawn.